I never thought I'd be packing my life into a single suitcase at 67. The day Brady told me I had to leave, I was polishing our wedding photo, the one where his father, and I looked so young and hopeful, 41 years of marriage, raising a son, surviving cancer together, and 6 years of helping Brady and Ava build their life after his father died. All of it suddenly didn't matter. Ava needs space to prepare for the baby, he said, avoiding my eyes. She thinks having you here is too stressful. His voice cracked like he was still 12 years old asking permission to stay up past curfew. But how could a woman who's carrying your grandchild see you as nothing but stress? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it all began to unravel started like any other Tuesday in our little house outside Ashland. I was in the kitchen at 6:30, the way I'd been every morning for the past 6 years since Harold died. The coffee was brewing, and I had my hands deep in the flour, making the buttermilk biscuits that Brady had loved since he was small. Enough to stand on a chair beside me. More hindrance than help. The recipe came from my mother's wooden box, the one with the faded roses painted on the lid. Each card was yellowed and stained with decades of use, some written in my grandmother's careful script, others in my own hurried handwriting from the early days of marriage when I was still learning to feed a family. This particular recipe for buttermilk biscuits had been perfected through countless Sunday mornings, sick days, and celebrations. It was one of the few things I'd brought with me when I moved in with Brady and Ava after Harold's funeral. The house felt different in those early morning hours before anyone else stirred. It was the only time it felt like mine, when I could move through the kitchen without feeling like an intruder in my own son's life. The morning light filtered through the gingham curtains I'd sewn myself, casting familiar shadows across the countertops I'd learned to navigate in the dark. Brady had been 17 when his father was first diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I remember the way his face had gone pale in the doctor's office, how he'd looked between Harold and me as if waiting for one of us to tell him it was all a mistake. Harold lived for more years after that diagnosis, longer than anyone expected. And Brady spent those years growing from a boy who still needed me to pack his lunch into a man who held his father's hand during the worst of the chemotherapy sessions. When Harold finally passed, Brady was 25 and newly married to Ava. They'd been together since college, one of those relationships that seemed to drift into marriage more from momentum than passion. Ava was practical and ambitious, the kind of woman who had her life planned out in 5-year increments. She'd graduated with a business degree and immediately landed a position at a marketing firm in Medford. Brady, meanwhile, had found steady work as an accountant for a small firm that handled mostly local businesses. Their modest ranch house had been a stretch financially, even with both their incomes. The mortgage, the car payments, the endless stream of expenses that come with starting a life together, it all added up to stress that showed in the tight lines around Brady's eyes and the way Ava would go silent when bills arrived in the mail. So when Harold died and left me with our paid-off house and his pension, it seemed natural that I would sell everything and move in with them. Brady needed the emotional support, and they needed the financial help. I told myself it was temporary, just until they got on their feet, until the grief settled into something manageable. But 6 years had passed, and temporary had become permanent. My financial contribution had allowed them to renovate the kitchen, finish the basement, and even take a vacation to Europe last spring. Ava's career had flourished, and Brady had been promoted twice. The stress lines had faded from his face, replaced by the comfortable contentment of a man whose bills were paid and whose future seemed secure. I'd found my place in their household, or so I thought. I did the cooking, most of the cleaning, and managed the household schedules with the efficiency I'd learned during my 30 years as a hospice nurse. I was useful, needed, part of the fabric of their daily life. When Ava worked late, I had dinner waiting for Brady. When they wanted to go out with friends, I was there to keep the house running smoothly. Looking back now, I can see how carefully Ava had begun to orchestrate my isolation. It started small, suggestions that I might be more comfortable eating dinner earlier, before they got home from work. Comments about how the house felt crowded when we were all in the living room at the same time, little changes in routine. That gradually pushed me to the margins of the life I thought I was sharing with them. But that Tuesday morning, kneading dough in the quiet kitchen, I was still operating under the illusion that I belonged there. The biscuits were in the oven when I heard Ava's alarm go off upstairs, followed by the sound of the shower. Brady would be down in 20 minutes, looking for coffee and something to eat before his commute to the office. I set the table for 3. The way I always did, with the blue ceramic plates Harold and I had received as a wedding gift. Ava rarely ate breakfast, preferring to grab a protein bar on her way out the door, but I always set her place anyway. Hope, I suppose, that one morning she might sit down with us, that we might find our way back to being a family instead of 3 people sharing the same address. Brady appeared right on schedule, his hair still damp from the shower, adjusting his tie with the same concentration his father had shown every morning for 40 years. He was Harold's son in so many ways: the careful attention to his appearance, the quiet way he moved through the morning routine, the grateful smile when he saw breakfast waiting for him. "Smells like heaven in here, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek before settling into his chair. It was our ritual, this morning greeting, one of the few times during the day when he seemed fully present with me instead of distracted by work or Ava's endless projects for the house. "Fresh biscuits," I said, setting the plate in front of him. "And there's honey from Marla's hives." Marla Singh had been my best friend since Harold and I moved to Ashland 35 years ago. She lived 10 minutes away in a house she'd filled with her ceramic art and rescue cats, and she kept bees in her backyard with the dedication of someone tending a meditation garden. Her friendship had been a lifeline during Harold's illness and after his death, though I saw her less often now that I was living with Brady and Ava. Brady bit into the biscuit and closed his eyes, the same expression of contentment he'd worn. "As a child, I was thinking about Dad yesterday," he said. "About those Sunday mornings when he'd read the paper out loud while you cooked. Remember how he'd do all the voices for the comic strips?" I smiled, the memory as warm as the oven behind me. "He always claimed he was practicing for when you had children of your own." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning neither of us was ready to examine. Brady and Ava had been married for 8 years now, and children had been in the plans for the last 3 of those years. But plans, as I'd learned in my 67 years, don't always align with reality. "Actually," Brady said, setting down his coffee cup with the careful precision that meant he'd been rehearsing this conversation, "Ava, and I have some news." My heart jumped, the way it does when you sense something important is coming, but you're not sure whether to hope or worry. "Good news, I hope, the best." His smile was genuine, the first truly unguarded expression I'd seen from him in months. "We're pregnant, Mum." Finally, the joy hit me like a wave, washing away every small worrying and disappointment of the past months. A grandchild, Harold's legacy, continuing into the next generation. The family Brady and I had both wanted for so long, finally becoming reality. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "How wonderful. How is Ava feeling? When is the baby due?" "She's been pretty sick in the mornings, but the doctor says that's normal. We're about 12 weeks along, so the baby should come in early March." He squeezed my hand back, and for a moment we were just mother and son sharing one of life's great joys. "March," I repeated, already thinking ahead to spring babies and Easter egg hunts and all the rituals of grandmotherhood I'd been dreaming about for years. "Have you started thinking about names? We've talked about it. If it's a boy, we're thinking about Harold as a middle name." For Dad, the tears came without warning, sudden and overwhelming. Harold would have been so proud, so excited about the prospect of a grandchild. He'd talked about it often during his illness, worried that he might not live to see Brady become a father. He would have loved that, I managed to say. "He would have been so happy about all of this." "I know," Brady said quietly. "I wish he could have been here to see it." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in thoughts of the man who'd shaped our family and left such a hole when he died. Then Brady cleared his throat, and I could hear the change in his tone before he spoke. "Mum, there's something else we need to talk about." The joy began to ebb, replaced by a familiar tension. In my experience, conversations that started with "we need to talk about" rarely ended well. The thing is, Brady continued, not meeting my eyes, Ava's been feeling really stressed lately. With the pregnancy and work and everything, she thinks ... we think. It might be better if the house was just the three of us, to give her space to adjust to everything. The words hit me like cold water. I set down my coffee cup carefully, buying time to process what he was really saying. Just the three of us, I repeated. The baby's going to change everything. Mom, we need to figure out how to be parents, how to be a family on our own. And Ava thinks having you here might make that transition harder. Harder how? Brady shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. She feels like she can't really be the woman of the house with you here. Like she's always being compared to how you do things. And with the baby coming, she wants to establish her own routines, her own way of running things. I thought about all the mornings I'd made breakfast for them, all the dinners waiting when they came home tired from work, all the ways I'd tried to make their lives easier and more comfortable. Apparently, Ava had experienced all of that as criticism rather than help. I see, I said. Though I didn't, not really. And where exactly do you think I should go? We've been looking into some options. There are some nice senior living communities in Medford, or maybe you could find a small apartment somewhere. You have Dad's pension and the money from selling the house. You could afford something really nice. Senior living communities. The phrase sat between us like a diagnosis, clinical and final. At 67, I was being retired from my own family, put out to pasture like an old horse who could no longer pull her weight. Brady, I said, keeping my voice steady, 6 years ago, when your father died, you asked me to come here. You said you needed me. I did need you, he said quickly. You saved us, Mom, financially and emotionally, but things are different now. We're in a good place, and the baby changes everything. It should change everything, I agreed. A baby should bring a family together, not tear it apart. We're not tearing anything apart. We're just ... restructuring. You'll still be part of everything. You'll be the baby's grandmother, but Ava needs to feel like she's the head of her own household. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and saw a stranger. Not because he was asking me to leave, though that cut deep enough, but because he couldn't seem to understand what he was asking me to give up. This wasn't just about finding a new place to live. It was about being told that the life I'd built, the role I'd filled, the family I'd helped support was no longer wanted. When? I asked. Soon, he said. Ava's been looking at some places for you. There's a really nice complex called Sunset Gardens that has an opening next month. 4 weeks to pack up 6 years of building a life with them, to find somewhere else to belong, to figure out how to be alone again at an age when most people were settled into their final chapters. I suppose I should be grateful she's done the research for me, I said, and immediately regretted the bitterness in my voice. Mom, please don't be like this. This isn't easy for any of us, isn't it? I asked. Because it seems pretty easy for Ava. Brady's face flushed, the way it always had when he felt caught between loyalties. She's pregnant, Mom, she's hormonal, and scared and trying to figure out how to be a mother. Can't you try to understand her perspective? I wanted to tell him that I understood perfectly, that I remembered being pregnant and scared and overwhelmed. I wanted to remind him that when he was born, his father and I had managed to figure out parenthood without ejecting inconvenient family members from our lives. But looking at his face, at the defensive set of his shoulders, I realized that this conversation was already over. The decision had been made, probably weeks ago, and this morning's news about the pregnancy was just the sugar coating on a bitter pill. Of course, I said instead. I want what's best for your family. Relief flooded his features. I knew you'd understand. You always do, but as I watched him finish his breakfast and gather his things for work, I wondered if understanding was really the virtue he thought it was, or if it was just another word for giving up without a fight. The conversation with Ava came that evening, and it was nothing like the gentle, apologetic discussion I'd had with Brady that morning. She was waiting for me in the living room when I came back from grocery shopping, sitting in Harold's old recliner like she owned it, which, I supposed, she now did. Zoe, she said, not bothering with pleasantries. Brady told me you to talk. This morning, I set my purse down carefully, buying myself a moment to read her expression. Ava had always been direct, but there was something different about her now, a hardness around her eyes that made her look older than her 32 years. He told me about the baby, I said. Congratulations, thank you. She didn't smile. He also told me about our conversation, as if she'd been part of the discussion instead of the invisible puppet master pulling the strings. Yes, I said simply. Good, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. She shifted forward in the chair, her hands folded over her still flat stomach in a gesture that seemed calculated for effect. This isn't personal, Zoe. It's just what's best for our family. Our family. The pronoun hung in the air between us, a clear delineation of who belonged and who didn't. I understand, I said, though the words tasted like ash. I've found a few places you might like, she continued, reaching for a folder on the side table. Sunset Gardens has a lovely one-bedroom available immediately. It's a senior community with a lot of activities and social opportunities. I think you'd really thrive there. She handed me the brochure with the same enthusiasm a realtor might show a house she was eager to unload. The cover featured smiling elderly people playing cards and tending to gardens, all of them looking delighted to be warehoused together in their golden years. The rent is very reasonable, Ava continued, and it includes most utilities. Plus, they have a dining room if you don't feel like cooking, and a shuttle service for shopping and appointments. I flipped through the glossy pages, noting the careful staging of each photograph. Happy seniors engaged in approved activities, their loneliness and displacement hidden behind bright smiles and cheerful common areas. It looks very nice, I said. Because she was clearly waiting for a response, I thought so too. I've already put in an application for you. The waiting list is usually quite long, but they had a cancellation, so there's an opening for March 1st. March 1st, less than 3 weeks away. She'd been planning this for a while, then, probably since she found out about the pregnancy. Maybe longer. That's very efficient of you, I said. Ava's smile was sharp. I like to be proactive. I've also taken the liberty of getting some information about moving services. There are companies that specialize in helping seniors relocate. They can pack everything for you and help you settle in, seniors. The word had become a label, a category that apparently came with its own set of handlers and management services. I wondered when I'd crossed the invisible line from being a useful member of the household to being a senior citizen in need of specialized assistance. Have you given any thought to what you'll want to take with you? She asked. The apartments are quite compact, so you'll probably want to be selective. I looked around the living room, taking inventory of 6 years of accumulated life. The throw pillows I'd made for the couch. The photographs of Brady and Harold that I'd arranged on the mantelpiece. The books I'd been slowly collecting, planning to read in my retirement. My mother's china cabinet, which held not just dishes, but decades of memories from family holidays and special occasions. I suppose I'll need to sort through things, I said. Of course. Take your time. Well, not too much time, she laughed, but there was no humor in it. But I'm sure you'll figure out what's really important to keep, what's really important. As if the artifacts of a lifetime could be divided into essential and disposable categories, as if the weight of memory could be measured by utility, Ava. I said carefully, can I ask you something? She nodded, though her posture suggested she was already bracing for an uncomfortable question. Have I done something to offend you? Something that made you feel I was interfering in your marriage or your home? For a moment, her composed facade slipped, and I saw something raw and defensive flash across her face. It's not about offense, she said. It's about boundaries. When Brady and I got married, we became our own family unit. Having you here has made it difficult for us to establish our own identity as a couple, I see. And how has my presence interfered with that identity? She sighed, as if explaining something obvious to a slow child. You do everything, Zoe. You cook, you clean, you manage the household. How is Brady supposed to see me as his partner when you're handling all the responsibilities of running a home? I felt a laugh bubble up, bitter and incredulous. So I've been too helpful. In a way, yes, Brady needs to depend on me, not on you. When he comes home to dinner that you've cooked, when he has clean clothes because you've done the laundry, when problems get solved because you've handled them, where does that leave me? It leaves you free to focus on your career and your marriage, I said. It leaves you unburdened by the daily maintenance of life, so you can pursue the things that matter to you. But don't you see? Those daily things are what marriage is built on: the small acts of service, the shared responsibilities, the way two people create a life together. You've been doing all of that for us, and it's made us lazy. It's made Brady lazy. There was truth in what she was saying, and that made it harder to argue with. I had taken over the household responsibilities, partly out of habit and partly out of a need to feel useful. But I'd done it with love, with the intention of making their lives easier and more comfortable. I was trying to help, I said. I know. You were, but helping isn't always the same thing as being helpful. Sometimes it's just enabling. The word stung. Enabling? As if my contributions to their household had been some sort of dysfunction rather than generosity. And now that you're pregnant, you want to establish yourselves as a self-sufficient family unit, I said. Exactly, relief flooded her voice, as if she was grateful I finally understood. This baby needs to see Brady and me as the heads of the household, as the people who take care of things and make decisions and create stability. How can we be? That if you're always there to step in, I nodded, though every part of me wanted to point out the flaws in her logic. If Brady was truly ready to be the head of a household, wouldn't he have had this conversation with me himself instead of sending his pregnant wife to deliver the message? If they were ready to be self-sufficient, why had they waited until I was paying half the household expenses to decide they needed independence? But I was tired, suddenly and deeply tired of being the reasonable one, the understanding one, the one who always found a way to make everyone else's decisions seem logical and fair. I'll start looking through my things this weekend, I said. Thank you. Beaver's smile returned, bright and relieved. I really think this will be best for everyone. You'll have your own space, your own independence. You can focus on your own interests instead of taking care of all of us. My own interests. After 6 years of making their interests my own, I wasn't even sure what those were anymore. That night, I sat in my bedroom, the guest room, really, though I'd been living in it for 6 years, and tried to imagine packing my life into boxes. The room was small and simply furnished, but I'd made it mine with photographs and books and the quilt my mother had made for my wedding. On the dresser sat Harold's watch and the compass he'd carried during his 2 years in the Navy. Small things, but they anchored me to the life I'd built and the person I'd been before I became Brady's mother and Harold's widow and Ava's inconvenient housemate. I opened the closet and stared at the clothes hanging there. Professional attire from my nursing days, now outdated and rarely worn. Casual clothes for the household work that apparently no longer needed my attention. A few nice dresses for holidays and special occasions, though those had become increasingly rare as Brady and Ava had begun celebrating with Ava's family or friends from work, rather than including me in their plans. When had I become so peripheral to my own son's life? When had my presence shifted from welcome to tolerated to unwanted? I tried to trace the progression, looking for the moment when everything had changed. But it had been so gradual that there was no clear line of demarcation. One day I was essential to their survival, and the next I was an obstacle to their growth. I pulled out my old suitcase, the one Harold and I had used for our honeymoon and every vacation afterward. It was worn leather, sore from years of use, with brass buckles that had tarnished to a dull gold. As I set it on the bed and opened it, the faint scent of Harold's cologne drifted out, a ghost of all the trips we'd taken together. This suitcase had carried our belongings to beach houses and mountain cabins, to visits with family and friends, to the hospital during Harold's final stay. It had been with us through the best and worst moments of our marriage, and now it would carry me away from the life I'd built with my son. I began with the practical things: underwear, nightgowns, enough clothes for a week or two while I figured out what came next. But as I folded each item and placed it in the suitcase, I felt like I was preparing for my own funeral, choosing what essential pieces of myself were worth preserving and what could be left behind. the photograph of Harold, and me on our wedding day went in first, wrapped carefully in tissue paper. Then the compass, the watch, and the small jewelry box that held my mother's engagement ring and the pearls Harold had given me for our 10th anniversary. Books would have to wait. There wasn't room for them in a suitcase, and I didn't yet know where I was going or what space would be available for the things that mattered to me. As I packed, I found myself thinking about Ava's words. Maybe she was right that I'd made them dependent on me, that my help had become a hindrance to their growth as a couple. But if that was true, what did it say about the past 6 years? Had I been fooling myself about my value to their family? Had my grief over Harold's death blinded me to the ways I was interfering in their marriage? Or was this simply what happened when children grew up and moved on, when the person who had once been essential to their survival became expendable? Maybe this was the natural order of things, and I'd just been too naive or too desperate to belong somewhere to see it coming. I closed the suitcase and set it by the door, then lay down on the bed fully clothed. Tomorrow I would call Marla and tell her what was happening. Tomorrow I would begin the process of untangling my life from Brady and Ava's, of figuring out how to be alone again after 6 years of shared meals and shared routines and shared space. But tonight, I just wanted to lie in the dark and grieve for the family I thought I'd been part of and the grandmother I thought I was going to be. Tomorrow I could be practical and understanding and mature about the whole situation. Tonight, I could just be heartbroken. Marla's reaction was exactly what I expected and exactly what I needed. "They what?" she said, her voice rising to a pitch that probably disturbed the cats sleeping in her sunny kitchen. I was sitting at her round oak table, the one she'd found at an estate sale, and painted bright turquoise against all conventional wisdom. It was the morning after my conversation with Ava, and I'd driven over early, needing to tell someone what was happening before I lost my nerve. "They want me to move out," I repeated. "Ava found a senior living place in Medford." "Senior living." Marla set down her coffee mug with enough fizz to rattle the saucer. "You're 67, not 97. And you're about as senior as I am, which is to say not at all ready for shuffleboard and early bird dinners. I think the point is that I'm not ready to be a grandmother living in their house," I said. "Ava wants to establish her own domestic authority. Ava wants to be the queen of her own little kingdom." "You mean?" Marla's dark eyes flashed with the righteous anger I'd been unable to muster for myself. "And your son is letting her banish you because he's too weak to stand up to his pregnant wife." The harsh assessment of Brady stung, but I couldn't argue with it. In 42 years of being his mother, I'd watched him struggle with confrontation, always choosing the path of least resistance, even when it meant disappointing people who mattered to him. "Maybe they're right," I said. "Maybe I have been interfering without realizing it." "Interfering?" Marla laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean by cooking and cleaning and paying for half their expenses, by being the unpaid housekeeper and nanny for 2 grown adults. I wasn't a nanny." "They don't have children." "No, but they sure acted like children, didn't they? Coming home to meals you prepared, leaving their dirty dishes for you to clean, letting you manage their social calendar and handle their household maintenance. What exactly were they doing while you were interfering in their lives?" I thought about it, really considered what Brady and Ava's daily routines had looked like for the past 6 years. They worked, certainly, and worked hard. But when they came home, they were guests in their own house, free to relax and pursue their own interests while I handled everything else. They were building their careers, I said, though it sounded weak even to me. "And what were you building?" "Zoe," the question hit me harder than I expected. What had I been building? I told myself I was building a relationship with my son, a place in his family, a role that mattered. But if they could dismiss me so easily, if my presence had become more burden than blessing, what had I actually accomplished? "I don't know," I admitted. Marla reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her fingers were stained with clay from her morning pottery session, strong and warm and reassuring. "You've been building a prison," she said gently. "A comfortable, loving prison, but a prison all the same. You've been so focused on being useful to them that you forgot how to be essential to yourself." "I am useful to them," I protested. "Anyone can be useful. Zoe, you can hire useful. You can replace useful." But you can't replace the people who matter to you. The people whose presence in your life makes everything richer and more meaningful. The question is, do you matter to them, or are you just useful? I wanted to argue, to defend Brady and the relationship I thought we had. But sitting in Marla's kitchen, surrounded by her art and her cats and the life she'd built for herself after her own husband died, I couldn't find the words. What am I going to do? I asked instead, well, you're not going to Sunset Gardens. That's for damn sure, Marla said. Have you seen that place? It's where people go to wait for death, not to start living again. I don't have many options. I can't afford much on just Harold's pension. Have you looked at any other possibilities? Apartments, small houses, something that's actually yours instead of another institutional setting. I hadn't, actually, Ava had presented Sunset Gardens as the obvious solution, and I'd been too shocked and hurt to question whether it was the right choice or just the convenient one. I wouldn't even know where to start, I said. Marla was already reaching for her laptop, the bright pink one she'd bought herself for her 70th birthday. Lucky for you, I do. Remember my friend Aylana, the one who moved to that little cottage community out by the lake? I did remember Aylana, a former teacher who downsized after her divorce and found unexpected happiness in a small rental cottage near Emigrant Lake. Marla had visited her there, and I'd been envious of the photographs she'd shown me, a tiny house surrounded by gardens, with a view of the water and mountains beyond. There are several cottages out there, Marla continued, typing rapidly. Some for sale, some for rent, much more affordable than those senior warehouses, and you'd actually have your own space, your own garden, your own life. She turned the laptop toward me, and I found myself looking at photographs of small, charming houses nestled among tall pines and native shrubs. They were simple structures, some barely larger than apartments, but each one had character and privacy, and the kind of setting that made you want to sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the day unfold. This one just came available, Marla said, clicking on a listing for a one-bedroom cottage with a stone fireplace and a covered porch. $800 a month, which includes water and garbage. Aylana says the landlord is a retired park ranger who maintains the property himself and gives tenants a lot of freedom to garden and customize their spaces. $800, less than half what Sunset Gardens would cost, and infinitely more appealing. The cottage in the photograph looked like a place where a person could think, could create, could start over. It's beautiful, I said. It's perfect. Marla corrected, and it's available immediately. Want to drive out and take a look? 2 hours later, I was standing on the porch of what might become my new home, breathing in the scent of pine and listening to the gentle lap of water against the distant shore. The cottage was even more appealing in person than it had been in the photographs, small but efficiently designed, with large windows that filled the interior with natural light, and a stone fireplace that would make winter evenings cozy and warm. The landlord, Jonas McRae, was a soft-spoken man in his early 60s who walked with the careful grace of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. He showed us through the cottage with the quiet pride of someone who'd put genuine care into maintaining a special place. The previous tenant was an artist, he explained, opening the door to a sunlit alcove off the main room. She used this as her studio. There's extra electrical for equipment, and the light is good all day long. I could see myself in that space, though I wasn't sure what I would create there. For so many years, my creative energy had gone into nurturing others. My patience, Harold, Brady, the idea of having space and time and solitude to discover what I might want to make for myself was both thrilling and terrifying. The community is small, Jonas continued as we walked back outside. Maybe a dozen cottages total, mostly retirees and artists. People tend to keep to themselves, but we help each other out when needed. Very quiet, very peaceful. When was the last time my life had been peaceful? Living with Brady and Ava had meant constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of the house, walking carefully around Ava's moods and Brady's stress, making myself useful without being intrusive. The idea of waking up in my own space, with no one to please but myself, felt like the most radical form of freedom. I'd like to put in an application, I said, surprising myself with the decisiveness in my voice. Jonas smiled. I'll get the paperwork. Ailana spoke very highly of you when she called this morning. Any friend of hers is welcome here. Marla had called Ailana while I was packing my suitcase the night before, and Ailana had called Jonas before we'd even finished our coffee that morning. In less than 24 hours, my friend had assembled a support network I hadn't even known I needed, had opened a door to possibilities I hadn't known existed. The drive back to Brady and Ava's house felt different now. Instead of returning to a place where I'd been asked to leave, I was going back to collect the pieces of my life that mattered and prepare for a new chapter. The cottage wouldn't be available until the following week, but Jonas had agreed to hold it for me, and I'd given him first month's rent and a security deposit from the emergency fund, Harold, and I'd maintained for exactly these kinds of unexpected transitions. Brady was waiting for me when I got home, sitting at the kitchen table with an expression that mixed relief and apprehension. Mom, I was worried about you. Ava said you left early this morning. I went to see Marla, I said, setting my purse down and turning to face him, and I found a place to live. His relief was visible. That's great. Sunset Gardens, no, a cottage by the lake. I'll be moving next week. Brady's face went through several expressions: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been disappointment. A cottage? Are you sure that's wise? I mean, you'll be all alone out there. What if something happens? It was the same question I'd been asking myself, but hearing it from him irritated me in a way I hadn't expected. When had my son started seeing me as fragile, as someone who couldn't be trusted to live independently? I've been living alone before, Brady. Before your father died, I managed a household and a career and a family without constant supervision. I know, but that was different. You're older now, and what? Suddenly incapable of taking care of myself. He backtracked quickly, the way he always did when confronted with conflict. That's not what I meant. I just worrying about you being isolated. I'll be less isolated there than I would be at Sunset Gardens, I said, and infinitely less isolated than I've been feeling here. The words hung between us, sharper than I'd intended, but more honest than I'd been in months. Brady looked stricken, as if he was finally beginning to understand the full implications of what they were asking me to do. Mom, this wasn't supposed to hurt you. We just thought you thought what was easiest for Ava was what was best for everyone, I finished. And maybe that's true. Maybe this is exactly what all of us need. I was surprised to find that I meant it, standing in that cottage, imagining my own space and my own routines and my own choices about how to spend my days. I'd felt something I hadn't experienced in years, excitement about the future. When do you move? Brady asked. Next week. I'll need to arrange for movers for the larger items. My bedroom furniture, some books, a few pieces from the living room that belong to your father and me. What about the rest of it? All the things you've accumulated here. I looked around the kitchen, taking inventory of 6 years of gradual accumulation. Dishes and small appliances and decorative items that had made this space feel like mine, but weren't truly necessary for starting. Over, I'll take what matters, I said. The rest can stay here for your new family. Brady nodded, though he still looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. Ava will want to help you pack. That won't be necessary, I said quickly. Marla is going to help me, and the moving company can handle the heavy items. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The last thing I needed was Ava's efficiency applied to dismantling my life, her decisive sorting of what was worth keeping and what could be discarded. This transition was going to be difficult enough without having to watch my belongings disappear into donation boxes under the supervision of the woman who'd engineered my exile. That night, I began the process of sorting through my possessions. With new eyes, instead of asking what I could bear to leave behind, I asked what I wanted to take with me into this new phase of my life. The shift in perspective was surprisingly liberating. Rather than focusing on loss, I was choosing what mattered enough to carry forward. My mother's recipe box would come with me, along with Harold's compass and watch, the quilt from our bed, the photograph albums that chronicled Brady's childhood and our family's history. My nursing textbooks, which I'd kept out of sentiment and professional pride, would stay behind. The good china would come, but the everyday dishes could remain for Brady and Ava's used odd as I worked. I found myself thinking about Jonas's comment about the previous tenant being an artist. What would I do with all the time and space I was about to have? For 6 years, my days had been structured around Brady and Ava's needs and schedules. Soon, I would wake up with nothing but my own inclinations to guide how I spent my time. The prospect was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. But as I carefully wrapped Harold's compass in tissue paper and placed it in the box of essential items, I realized that maybe learning to navigate by my own internal direction was exactly what I needed to do. Moving day arrived with the kind of crisp February morning that makes Oregon winters bearable. The movers came early, efficient men who treated my belongings with careful respect as they loaded them into their truck. Marla had arrived even earlier, armed with coffee and pastries from our favorite bakery and the kind of fierce organizational energy that made difficult transitions manageable. Brady helped, carrying boxes and directing the movers with the methodical attention to detail he'd inherited from his father. Ava stayed inside, claiming morning sickness, though I suspected she was simply avoiding the awkwardness of watching me leave. I was grateful for her absence. This transition was difficult enough without having to navigate her carefully constructed expressions of concern and relief. The cottage felt different when I walked through it for the second time. No longer a charming possibility, but an actual destination. Jonas had left a small bouquet of early daffodils on the kitchen counter with a note welcoming me to the community, and I found myself unexpectedly moved by the simple gesture of hospitality. "This is perfect for you," Marla said, standing in the living room as the movers arranged my furniture in the space. "Look how the light hits that wall. You could hang Harold's paintings there." Harold had been an amateur watercolorist, painting landscapes during our weekend trips around Oregon. I'd almost left the paintings behind, thinking they would be too painful to live with. But now I was glad I'd packed them. They would transform these unfamiliar walls into something that felt like home. The process of settling in took most of the day, but by evening I was sitting on my own porch, drinking tea from my own cups, watching the sun set over the lake. The silence was profound after years of living with other people's schedules and sounds. No television voices from the living room, no phone conversations leaking through thin walls, no careful navigation around other people's moods and needs, just silence and the gentle sound of water against the shore, and the knowledge that tomorrow I could wake up whenever I chose and spend the day however I pleased. The first week passed in a haze of small discoveries. The morning light that filled the kitchen at exactly 7:30. The family of deer that grazed in the meadow behind the cottages each evening. The way the stone fireplace heated the entire small space, making it cozy even on the coldest days. I fell into new routines slowly, the way water finds its course down a hillside. Morning coffee on the porch if the weather was mild, afternoon walks around the lake, evening reading by the fire. Simple rhythms that belonged to no one but me. It was during my second week at the cottage that I first saw Jonas working in his garden. He lived in a slightly larger cottage at the end of the lane, and from my kitchen window I could see him tending to raised beds that were obviously his pride and joy. Even in late winter, the garden had a carefully maintained beauty, with structural plants and cold weather vegetables that suggested both expertise and genuine love for growing things. I'd been working on my own small plot, trying to clear years of neglect and prepare the soil for spring planting. Gardening had been one of my great pleasures when Harold and I owned our house, but living with Brady and Ava had meant working in flower beds that belonged to someone else, subject to their preferences and long-term plans. Mind if I offer some advice? Jonas called one morning as I struggled with a particularly stubborn root system. I looked up, grateful for the interruption. "Please, I'm afraid I'm better with indoor plants than outdoor archaeology." He walked over, moving with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in natural spaces. This whole area was wild blackberry until about 5 years ago. The roots go deep, but if you cut them back gradually and keep pulling the new shoots, you'll eventually starve them out. Gradually, I repeated. I was hoping for more immediate results. "Most good things take time," he said. then seemed to hear the philosophical weight of his words and smiled. That probably sounds like the kind of fortune cookie wisdom people our age is supposed to dispense. Are we supposed to dispense wisdom? I asked. I must have missed that memo, he laughed, a genuine sound that made him look younger than his years. According to my daughter, I'm at the age where everything I say is either sage advice or embarrassing nonsense. There's apparently no middle ground. You have a daughter, 2 daughters, actually. One in Portland, one in Seattle, both convinced that living out here alone is either the height of enlightened independence or the beginning of my slide into eccentric hermit territory. I could relate to the family dynamics he was describing. Brady had called twice since I'd moved, both conversations carefully neutral, as if he was checking on an elderly relative rather than his mother. The concerned tone in his voice suggested he was still processing the idea of me living independently. What do you think? I asked. About which, the sage advice or the hermit territory? About living out here alone, Jonas considered the question, while examining the blackberry root I'd been fighting. I think solitude and loneliness are completely different things, and most people don't understand the distinction. I'm more alone here than I've ever been, but I'm also less lonely. That's a very sophisticated way of saying you like it here. I like it here, he agreed. But it took me a while to figure out the difference between choosing to be alone and being abandoned to aloneness. The comment hit closer to home than I was comfortable with. And which category do I fall into? That's not really for me to determine, is it? But you're here by choice, in a place you picked, doing work you want to do. He gestured toward my garden plot. That suggests you're choosing solitude rather than just accepting isolation. I thought about that distinction as I continued working in the garden over the following days. Was I choosing solitude, or was I just making the best of a situation that had been forced on me? The answer seemed to shift depending on my mood and the particular challenges of any given day. Some mornings I woke up energized by the freedom to structure my time however I wanted. Other days the silence felt oppressive, and I found myself wondering what Brady and Ava were doing. Whether they were managing without my help, whether they ever thought about me at all. It was during one of those less optimistic days that I received an unexpected visitor. I was sitting on my porch, reading and feeling sorry for myself, when a car pulled into my driveway. For a moment my heart jumped, thinking it might be Brady coming to visit. But as the driver got out, I realized it was a woman I didn't recognize. She was probably in her 40s, with the confident posture of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. Her professional attire suggested she wasn't a neighbor, and her expression was serious enough to make me wonder if something had happened to Brady. Mrs. Pinvold, she said as she approached the porch. Yes. I'm Gretchen Alvarez. I'm a midwife in Ashland, and I'm working with your daughter-in-law, Ava. My stomach dropped. Is something wrong with the baby? May I sit down? She asked, gesturing toward the empty chair beside me. I nodded, suddenly too nervous to speak. Gretchen settled herself carefully, as if choosing her words with equal care. Everything is fine with the pregnancy from a health standpoint, she said. But I wanted to talk to you about something that's been troubling me. About Ava? About the family dynamics I've been observing during our appointments. Gretchen folded her hands in her lap, her expression professionally neutral but concerned. Ava mentioned that you'd recently moved out of their home. Yes, I said simply, not sure where this conversation was headed. She presented it as a mutual decision, something that would be better for everyone involved. That's one way to put it. Gretchen nodded. Mrs. Pinvold, I've been doing this work for 22 years. I've seen a lot of family configurations, a lot of different ways that households adjust to pregnancy and new babies. What I haven't seen very often is a situation where an experienced, supportive family member is removed from the support system right before a first baby arrives. I don't think Ava saw me as supportive, I said. She felt I was interfering with their ability to establish themselves as an independent family unit. That may be what she told you, but it's not consistent with what I observe when your son and daughter-in-law interact. Brady seems anxious and overwhelmed by the prospect of parenthood. Ava seems to be carrying all the emotional labor of preparing for this baby. Removing an experienced caregiver from that situation doesn't make sense. From a practical standpoint, I wasn't sure how to respond. Was Gretchen suggesting that Ava had made a mistake in asking me to leave? Or was she implying something more serious about my son and daughter-in-law's relationship? Mrs. Pinvold, Gretchen continued, I'm going to share something with you that I probably shouldn't, but my conscience won't let me ignore it. She paused, clearly wrestling with some kind of professional ethical boundary. During Ava's last appointment, there was a discrepancy in the dating of the pregnancy. What kind of discrepancy? When she first came to see me, she said she was 12 weeks along, which would put conception around early November. But when I did the ultrasound, the fetal development suggested she was actually about 14 weeks along, which would put conception in mid to late October. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. 2 weeks isn't very much, is it? Couldn't there be natural variation? There can be some variation, yes, but Ava was very specific about the dates when I asked her about it. She said she and Brady had been trying for several months, and that she knew exactly when conception occurred because they'd been tracking her cycle carefully. So if the baby is 2 weeks older than she originally thought, it would mean conception occurred during a time when she claimed she and Brady weren't intimate because he was traveling for work. Gretchen's voice was gentle but clear. Mrs. Pinvold, I think your daughter-in-law may be carrying a child that isn't your son's. The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence. I felt as if the ground had shifted beneath me, as if everything I thought I understood about the situation had suddenly become uncertain. Are you sure? I asked. I'm sure about the dates, Gretchen said. I'm not sure about what those dates mean, but I think someone in the family should be aware of the discrepancy. Why are you telling me this instead of Brady? Because Brady isn't my patient, and because ... double quote, she hesitated. Because in my experience, pregnant women who are hiding the paternity of their babies often try to isolate themselves from family members who might ask uncomfortable questions or notice inconsistencies. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Ava hadn't asked me to leave because I was interfering with their marriage. She'd asked me to leave because she was afraid I might figure out that she was carrying another man's child. What should I do with this information? I asked. That's not for me to say, Gretchen replied. I just thought you should know that your removal from their household might not have been about what's best for their family. It might have been about protecting a secret. After Gretchen left, I sat on my porch for a long time, watching the light change over the lake and trying to process what I'd learned. If she was right, if Ava was indeed carrying another man's child, then everything about the past few weeks made a terrible kind of sense. The sudden urgency about establishing independence. The insistence that I move out immediately rather than gradually, the way Ava had taken control of every aspect of my relocation, ensuring that I was far enough away to avoid casual involvement in the pregnancy. But if the baby wasn't Brady's, what was I supposed to do with that knowledge? Should I confront Ava directly? Should I tell Brady what I suspected? Should I do nothing and hope that the truth would eventually come to light on its own? I thought about my son, about the joy on his face when he told me about the pregnancy, about the way he talked about naming the baby after his father. If Gretchen was right, Brady was about to spend the rest of his life raising and loving a child who wasn't biologically his, believing that he was continuing Harold's legacy when he was actually being deceived about the most fundamental aspect of his marriage. The sun was setting by the time I went inside, and I still didn't know what to do with the information Gretchen had shared. But I knew that my exile from Brady and Ava's household had taken on a completely different meaning. I wasn't just a displaced mother-in-law learning to live independently. I was possibly the only person who could prevent my son from building his life on a foundation of lies. I spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with what Gretchen had told me. By the 4th day, I was exhausted from the weight of carrying such a devastating secret, and I knew I had to talk to someone before the knowledge consumed me entirely. Marla was the obvious choice, the only person I trusted completely to help me think through the implications and consequences of what I might or might not do. She arrived at my cottage within an hour of my phone call, bearing groceries and the kind of fierce determination that meant she was prepared to stay as long as necessary to help me work through the crisis. Tell me everything, she said. settling into my kitchen chair with a cup of coffee and the focused attention she usually reserved for her most complex ceramic projects. I recounted Gretchen's visit, the discrepancy in the pregnancy dates, and the terrible possibility that Brady was being deceived about the paternity of the child he was so excited to welcome. Marla listened without interruption, her dark eyes growing increasingly troubled. As the full scope of the situation became clear, "Jesus, Zoe," she said when I finished. "If this is true, it changes everything. I know, but what am I supposed to do with it? I have no proof beyond one midwife's observations. And even if I'm right, is it my place to interfere in their marriage?" "Their marriage?" Marla's voice rose sharply. "If Ava is passing off another man's child as Brady's, there is no marriage. There's just fraud and betrayal wrapped up in wedding vows. But what if I'm wrong? What if there's an innocent explanation for the dating discrepancy? If I confront them with accusations and I'm mistaken, I'll destroy any chance of having a relationship with Brady or the baby." Marla considered this, her fingers drumming against the coffee mug in the rhythm she used when she was thinking through a particularly challenging problem. "You need more information," she said finally. "Before you do anything irreversible, you need to know for certain whether your suspicions are justified. How am I supposed to get more information? I can't exactly hire a private investigator to follow my pregnant daughter-in-law around, no, but you can pay attention. You can watch for patterns, inconsistencies, opportunities to learn more about what's really going on in their marriage." The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 2 days later, Brady called to ask if I could meet him for lunch in town. He sounded stressed and tired, and when I saw him at the restaurant, he looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. "Mom," he said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, "I'm glad you agreed to meet me. I've been feeling terrible about how everything happened with your move." "You don't need to feel terrible," I said, though part of me appreciated hearing that. He'd been struggling with the situation. "I'm settling in well at the cottage. Are you really?" He studied my face with the careful attention of someone trying to gauge whether I was telling the truth or just being polite. "Because Ava thinks maybe we moved too fast, pushed you out before you were ready." Ava thinks, the phrase triggered an immediate wariness. In my experience, when Brady attributed an opinion to Ava, it usually meant he was testing the waters for something she wanted him to say. "I'm fine, Brady. The cottage is beautiful. And I'm enjoying the independence." "Good, that's good." He relaxed slightly, but there was still tension around his eyes. "The thing is, Ava was wondering if you might be willing to help us with something." And there it was. The real reason for this lunch, the favor that Ava had sent him to request now that I was safely out of their daily lives. "What kind of help?" I asked. "Well, you know how she's been having a difficult pregnancy. The morning sickness has been really severe, and she's been having trouble keeping up with everything at work and at home." I waited, knowing there was more coming. "She was wondering if you might be able to come over a couple times a week, just to help with some of the household things. Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. Just until she gets through the worst of the first trimester." The irony was breathtaking. 6 weeks ago, my daily help with cooking and cleaning had been interference that prevented them from establishing their independence. Now that they were experiencing the reality of managing a household without my unpaid labor, suddenly my assistance was needed again. "I see," I said carefully. "And this would be temporary?" "Oh, absolutely. Just until she's feeling better, maybe a month or two at most." "A month or two?" Which would conveniently cover the period when Ava was most likely to let something slip about the true timeline of her pregnancy, when careful observation might reveal the inconsistencies that Gretchen had noticed. "I'd be willing to help," I said, surprising myself with the decision. "But I'd need to know that it really is temporary, and that I'm being asked as a favor rather than expected as an obligation." Relief flooded Brady's face. "Of course, we really appreciate it, Mom, and we'll pay you for your time, naturally. Pay Emmy for doing the same work I'd done freely for 6 years, before I became an inconvenience rather than an asset to their household." "That won't be necessary," I said. "I'm happy to help family." We arranged that I would come over 3 mornings a week, arriving after Brady left for work and leaving before he returned. The schedule would give me regular access to their house, and to Ava when she was likely to be most unguarded, dealing with pregnancy symptoms and the stress of maintaining her daily routines. It would also give me the opportunity to look for evidence of what Gretchen suspected, to search for signs of an affair or clues about the real timeline of Ava's pregnancy. The first morning I returned to their house felt surreal. Walking through the door with my own key, seeing the familiar rooms with the slight disarray that had accumulated in my absence, I felt like a ghost returning to haunt a life I'd once lived. Ava was in the kitchen when I arrived, sitting at the table in her bathrobe, looking genuinely miserable. Her skin had the greyish pallor that comes with severe morning sickness, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. "Zoe," she said, managing a weak smile. "Thank you so much for coming. I know this is awkward after everything that happened." "It's not awkward," I lied. "Your family, and you need help. I feel terrible about asking you to do this after asking you to move out. Brady says you understand, but I still feel guilty." I studied her face, looking for signs of deception or calculation, but all I saw was exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Pregnancy is difficult," I said. "You shouldn't feel guilty about needing support." She nodded gratefully and retreated upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen to begin the work of caring for a household that was no longer mine. As I loaded the dishwasher and started a load of laundry, I found myself looking for clues to support or disprove Gretchen's suspicions. The refrigerator held appointment cards for Ava's prenatal visits, but they only confirmed what I already knew about the timing. The desk in the living room had various pregnancy and baby-related materials, but nothing that revealed any inconsistencies in her story. It was while I was cleaning the master bedroom that I found the first piece of evidence that suggested Gretchen might be right. Ava's phone was charging on the nightstand, and as I dusted around it, a text message notification appeared on the lock screen. "Missing you. Can't wait to see you next week." The message was innocent enough on its surface, but the tone seemed oddly intimate for a casual friend or co-worker. I made a mental note of the initial and continued cleaning, trying to appear focused on my work while keeping my attention tuned to any other potential clues. Over the following weeks, I developed a routine of careful observation disguised as helpful efficiency. I learned that Ava received frequent calls that she took in private, usually stepping onto the back porch or into the bathroom when her phone rang. She had started receiving packages that she retrieved from the porch immediately, before I could see the return addresses. And she had begun making excuses to leave the house for appointments and errands that seemed to require more time than their stated purposes would suggest. None of this was conclusive evidence of an affair, but it painted a picture of someone who was being deliberately secretive about aspects of her life. Combined with the pregnancy dating discrepancy that Gretchen had identified, it began to build a case that my suspicions might be justified. The breakthrough came during my 4th week of helping with their household. I was cleaning the bathroom when I heard Ava's phone ring in the bedroom. She was downstairs doing laundry, and the phone was apparently forgotten on the nightstand. I listened to her footsteps on the stairs, knowing she would be coming to answer it. But the ringing stopped before she reached the bedroom, and I heard her voice through the thin floor as she answered what must have been a call to the landline in the kitchen. "Hello, Doe. Hi, Marcus. No, I can't talk right now. I told you not to call the house. I know, but it's complicated, Marcus." The initial from the text message I'd seen. Ava's voice had dropped to the urgent whisper of someone having a conversation they didn't want overheard. I moved closer to the bathroom door, straining to hear more of the conversation, but her voice was too quiet to make out specific words. After a few minutes, I heard her hang up and return to the laundry room, humming with what sounded like nervous energy. When I came downstairs to get cleaning supplies from the kitchen, Ava was folding towels with the kind of focused concentration that suggested she was trying not to think about something else. "Everything okay?" I asked casually. "Fine," she said quickly. "Just a work call. You know how it is." But I was beginning to know exactly how it was. Marcus wasn't a work colleague calling about business during normal business hours. Marcus was someone Ava didn't want Brady to know about, someone she was taking care not to have extended conversations with when other people might overhear. That evening, I called Marla and shared what I'd observed over the past month. The pattern of secretive behavior, the phone calls she took in private, the name markers that had appeared in both a text message and a phone conversation she clearly didn't want me to overhear. It's not proof, I concluded, but it's starting to look very much like Gretchen was right to be concerned. So what's your next step? Marla asked. I don't know. I can't keep spying on my daughter-in-law indefinitely, hoping to catch her in a lie. But I also can't ignore what I'm seeing, especially if it means Brady is being deceived about the paternity of this baby. Maybe you don't need to catch her in a lie, Marla said thoughtfully. Maybe you just need to give her an opportunity to tell the truth. The idea was both appealing and terrifying. Confronting Ava directly would fix the issue one way or another, but it would also burn any bridges that might still exist between us. If I was wrong about the affair, if there was an innocent explanation for everything I'd observed, I would destroy any chance of maintaining a relationship with Brady's family. But if I was right, if Ava was indeed carrying another man's child, while allowing Brady to believe he was the father, then my silence would make me complicit in a deception that would shape the rest of my son's life. I need to think about this, I told Marla. I need to figure out how to approach her in a way that gives her a chance to be honest without backing her into a corner where she has no choice but to lie. You'll figure it out, Marla said. You always do, but as I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet cottage, watching the last light fade over the lake, I wasn't sure I had the courage to do what needed to be done. Confronting Ava about her possible affair would require a kind of strength I wasn't sure I possessed, the strength to risk everything for the sake of truth. The question was whether my love for Brady was strong enough to overcome my fear of losing him entirely. The opportunity to confront Ava came 2 weeks later, during what should have been a routine morning of household help. I arrived to find her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone with an expression of such distress that I immediately knew something significant had happened. Ava, I said, setting down my purse and approaching her carefully. Are you all right? She looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and swollen from crying. For a moment, she seemed about to speak, then shook her head and looked back down at her phone. I'm fine, she said, but her voice was thick with tears. Just pregnancy hormones making everything feel overwhelming. I'd seen enough genuine emotional distress during my nursing career to recognize that this was more than hormonal mood swings. Ava was in crisis, wrestling with something that had shaken her to her core. Would you like to talk about it? I asked, sitting down across from her at the table. Sometimes it helps to share what's troubling you, she laughed, but there was no humor in it. I don't think you're the person I should be talking to about this. Why not? Because, she trailed off, looking at me with an expression that was part desperation and part calculation. Because you're Brady's mother, and this is about things that affect Brady. My heart began to race. Was she about to confess what I'd been suspecting? Was the weight of her deception finally becoming too much to bear? Ava, I said gently, whatever is troubling you, my primary concern is for the well-being of my family. That includes you and the baby. She studied my face as if trying to gauge whether she could trust me, whether I was someone who could handle whatever truth she was carrying. Zoe, she said finally, what would you do if you'd made a mistake that was going to hurt someone you love, but telling the truth about the mistake would hurt them even more? The question hung between us, loaded with implications that made my stomach clench with anxiety. I think, I said carefully, that the truth usually hurts less in the long run than living with a lie. Even if the truth would destroy everything. Even if it would ruin someone's life and happiness. Ava, are you trying to tell me something specific? She was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing patterns on the table surface as she wrestled with whatever decision she was trying to make. The baby, she said finally, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. What about the baby? There's a chance. She stopped, took a deep breath, and started again. There's a possibility that Brady isn't the father. The confession hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting it for weeks. Hearing her actually say the words made the situation real in a way that my suspicions and Gretchen's observations hadn't. A possibility. I asked, I had an affair, she said, the words rushing out as if she was afraid she'd lose her nerve if she didn't say them quickly. Last fall, when Brady was traveling so much for work. I was lonely and angry, and I made a terrible mistake with Marcus. Her head snapped up, surprise and fear flashing across her face. How do you know about Marcus? I've seen his name on your phone. I've heard you take his calls. She closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, the last of her defenses crumbling. God, you must think I'm awful. I think you're human, I said, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what she was confessing. I think you made a mistake, and now you're trying to figure out how to deal with the consequences. The timing ... double quote, she said, opening her eyes and looking at me with naked desperation. The baby could be Brady's, but it could also be Marcus's. There's no way to know for sure until after it's born, and even then ... even then, you'd need a paternity test to know for certain, yes, and how do I explain to Brady why I need a paternity test? How do I tell the man who's been so excited about becoming a father that the child he's been dreaming about might not be his? I could see the trap she'd created for herself, the way her initial deception had led to increasingly complex lies that were now threatening to collapse under their own weight. How long has the affair been going on? I asked. It's over, she said quickly. It ended when I found out I was pregnant. But Marcus ... he knows about the baby, and he knows there's a chance it's his. Is that why he's been calling? Is he pressuring you about the situation? She nodded miserably. He wants me to leave Brady. He thinks we should be together if the baby is his. But I love Brady, Zoe. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I love my husband, and I don't want to lose him. But you're willing to let him raise another man's child without knowing the truth. I don't know. The words came out as a wail of anguish. I don't know what to do. Every option feels like it will destroy everything. I reached across the table and took her hand, surprised by my own impulse to comfort her despite the magnitude of her betrayal. Ava, I said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Is the reason you asked me to move out because you were afraid I might figure out the truth about the pregnancy? She was quiet for so long that I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she nodded, so slightly that I almost missed it. I was terrified, she whispered. You know Brady so well, and you were around so much. I was afraid you'd notice inconsistencies, or that I'd say something that would give me away. I thought if I could just get through the pregnancy without anyone knowing, maybe I could figure out a way to handle everything after the baby was born. So you engineered my exile to protect your secret. I know how awful that sounds. I know how awful I am for doing it. But I was panicking, and I couldn't think of any other way to keep everything from falling apart. The confirmation of what I'd suspected should have made me angry, but instead I felt a strange sense of relief. My instincts had been correct, and the distance I'd felt from Brady and the rejection I'd experienced hadn't been about my failures as a mother-in-law. They'd been about Ava's desperate attempt to hide her infidelity. Ava, I said, you can't build a marriage on a foundation of lies. And you can't ask Brady to commit his life to raising a child without giving him the choice to make that decision with full knowledge of the situation. But what if I tell him and he leaves me? What if I lose everything? What if you don't tell him and he finds out later? What if the baby is born and doesn't look like Brady, or has medical issues that require genetic testing? What if Marcus decides he wants to be part of the child's life and contacts Brady directly? I could see these possibilities occurring too. Her as I spoke, each one adding to the weight of her fear and guilt. There's another issue, I continued gently. The midwife, Gretchen, has already noticed discrepancies in the pregnancy timeline. She's suspicious enough that she came to talk to me about it. Ava's face went pale. She talked to you. About what? About the dating of the pregnancy and about the family dynamics she's observed. She's concerned that Brady is being deceived about something important. Oh God, Ava said, burying her face in her hands. This is all falling apart, isn't it? It doesn't have to fall apart, I said, but it does have to come out. The only question is whether you tell Brady yourself, in a way that gives your marriage a chance to survive, or whether he finds out some other way that makes reconciliation impossible. We sat in silence for several minutes while Ava processed what I'd said. When she finally looked up, her face was streaked with tears, but there was something like resolution in her eyes. If I tell him, she said, will you help me? Help you? How will be there when I tell him? Help me explain why I did what I did. Help him understand that I never meant for any of this to happen. The request surprised me. After months of feeling excluded from their lives, Ava was asking me to be present for what might be the most important conversation of their marriage. Why would you want me there? I asked, because you're the only person who knows the whole truth, and because Brady trusts you. If you're there, if you help me explain, maybe he'll be more likely to listen instead of just walking away. I thought about what she was asking. Agreeing to help her tell Brady about the affair would mean taking sides in their marital crisis, potentially damaging my relationship with my son if he felt I'd known about the deception and hadn't warned him. But refusing to help would mean abandoning both of them at a moment when they desperately needed guidance from someone who loved them both and wanted their marriage to survive. When do you want to tell him? I asked. Soon, she said, before I lose my nerve. Before the situation gets any more complicated. This weekend, she nodded. Saturday evening, after dinner. When we have time to really talk through everything. All right, I said. I'll be here. As I drove back to my cottage that afternoon, I felt the weight of what I'd committed to doing. In 3 days, I would sit in the living room of the house I'd been asked to leave and help my daughter-in-law confess to an affair that might result in the end of their marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, I'd been told that my presence in their household was interfering with their ability to build a strong marriage. Now I was being asked to help save that marriage by facilitating the most difficult conversation they would ever have. But as I prepared for what was to come, I realized that this was exactly the kind of situation where my years of experience as a hospice nurse might actually be valuable. I'd spent decades helping families navigate the most difficult moments of their lives, finding ways to say the unsayable and face the unfaceable. If Brady and Ava's marriage was going to survive this crisis, it would require the same kind of courage and honesty that I'd witnessed in hospital rooms and family homes during my nursing career. The courage to face hard truths, the honesty to acknowledge painful realities, and the hope that love might be strong enough to survive even the worst mistakes. Saturday evening couldn't come fast enough, and it couldn't be delayed forever, either way. By Sunday morning, everything would be different for all of us. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of unseasonable warmth that makes February feel full of false promises. I drove to Brady and Ava's house as the sun was setting, my stomach tight with the knowledge of what was about to unfold. For 6 months, I'd been an outsider to their marriage, watching from a careful distance as they built the life they claimed they needed to create without my interference. Tonight, I would be more intimately involved in their relationship than I had ever been when I lived under their roof. Ava met me at the door, her face pale but determined. She'd dressed carefully for the occasion, as if the right outfit might somehow make the conversation easier. Brady was in the living room, reading the newspaper and looking completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. "Mom," he said, standing to greet me with genuine warmth, "I'm glad you could come for dinner. Ava made your pot roast recipe." The irony was almost unbearable. She'd cooked my recipe for what might be their last meal together as a married couple, using food as a comfort before delivering news that would shatter his sense of security. "It smells wonderful," I said, accepting his hug and trying to memorize the feeling of holding my son before he learned something that might change how he looked at everyone involved in this deception. Dinner was a surreal experience. Brady chatted about work and the preparations they were making for the baby, completely oblivious to the tension radiating from both Ava and me. He talked about converting the spare room into a nursery, about the parenting classes they'd signed up for, about his excitement for teaching his child to fish and camp and appreciate the outdoors the way Harold had taught him. Ava barely touched her food, pushing it around her plate while nodding at appropriate moments in Brady's monologue. I found myself memorizing his expressions, the animated way he gestured when he talked about the future, the unconscious way he reached over to touch Ava's hand when he mentioned their plans as a family. After dinner, Brady settled into his father's old recliner with a cup of coffee, expecting the comfortable evening routine that had been their pattern for years. Instead, Ava sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and I took the chair across from both of them. "Brady," Ava said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk about something important." He looked up from his coffee, immediately alert to the change in atmosphere. What's wrong? Is it the baby? In a way, she said, then stopped, looking at me with panic in her eyes. I nodded encouragingly, reminding her that she could do this, that honesty was the only way forward. Brady, she began again, I need to tell you something about the baby. About the pregnancy, about me. He set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his full attention focused on his wife. Ava, you're scaring me. What's going on? I made a mistake, she said, the words coming out in a rush. Last fall, when you were traveling so much, I was lonely and angry, and I made a terrible mistake. The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, the distant sound of a car passing on the street, the sharp intake of Brady's breath as he began to understand what she was telling him. What kind of mistake? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. I had an affair. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. Brady sat back in his chair, as if he'd been physically pushed. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, anger, disbelief, before settling into something that looked like numbness. An affair, he repeated. Double quotes. Yes. With who? Someone from work. Marcus Jameson from the marketing department. Brady nodded slowly, processing this information with the methodical attention to detail that he brought to his accounting work. How long? 3 months, from September until December. Until December. He was quiet for a moment, then his eyes sharpened with realization. Ava, the baby. I don't know, she said quickly, the timing. There's a possibility that Marcus is the father, but there's also a possibility that you are. I don't know for certain. The blood drained from Brady's face. You don't know if the baby I've been excited about, the baby we've been planning for, the baby I've been telling everyone about is actually mine. Brady, please let me explain. Explain what? His voice was rising, anger finally breaking through the shock. Explain how you've been lying to me for months. Explain how you let me believe I was going to be a father when you knew the baby might belong to your lover. You might still be the father, but I might not be. He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Jesus, Ava, how could you do this to me? How could you let me get attached to this baby? Let me start planning our future when you knew there was a chance none of it was real. I could see Ava struggling not to cry, trying to maintain enough composure to get through the conversation. I was scared, Brady. I was terrified of losing you, and I didn't know how to tell you. So you decided not to tell me at all. You were just going to let me raise another man's child without ever knowing the truth. I hoped. I thought maybe. If I waited until after the baby was born, if it looked like you, if there was no reason to suspect. You thought you could just hope for the best and lie to me for the rest of our lives if necessary. Brady's voice was incredulous. What if the baby didn't look like me? What if it had medical problems that required genetic testing? What if Marcus decided he wanted to be involved? These were the same questions I'd raised with Ava, and hearing Brady voice them confirmed that he was thinking through the long-term implications of her deception. I know it was wrong, Ava said, tears finally spilling over. I know I should have told you immediately. But I love you, Brady, and I was terrified of losing you. You love me. Brady laughed, but there was no humor in it. You love me so much that you cheated on me and then lied about it for months. The affair was a mistake. A terrible, stupid mistake that I regretted immediately. It meant nothing to me. It meant nothing to you. But it might have created a child that you're asking me to raise as my own. Brady turned to look at me, as if suddenly remembering that I was in the room. Mom, did you know about this? The question I'd been dreading. How much should I tell him about my suspicions, about Gretchen's visit, about the weeks I'd spent watching Ava for signs of deception? I suspected something was wrong, I said carefully. The midwife noticed some discrepancies in the pregnancy timeline and shared her concerns with me. The midwife knows. Brady's voice was flat with disbelief. How many people know about this? Just Gretchen, your mother, and me, Ava said quickly. And Marcus, of course Marcus knows. The man who might be the father of the baby. I've been planning to name after my dead father. The reference to Harold hit me like a physical blow. Brady had been so excited about the possibility of naming his son after his father, continuing the family legacy into the next generation. Now, that connection, that sense of continuity, was thrown into question. Brady, I said gently, I know this is devastating news, but the most important thing right now is figuring out how to move forward in a way that protects everyone involved, including the baby. He looked at me with something like betrayal in his eyes. Are you taking her side? I'm not taking anyone's. Sigh, I'm trying to help both of you work through this crisis in a way that gives your marriage a chance to survive. Survive? Brady shook his head. Mom, she cheated on me and then lied about it for months. She let me get excited about a baby that might not be mine. She asked you to move out of our house so you wouldn't discover her lies. How exactly is this? Marriage supposed to survive that? The reference to my displacement stung, but it also clarified something important. Brady was beginning to understand that Ava's decision to ask me to leave hadn't been about establishing independence. It had been about hiding her infidelity. Marriages can survive infidelity, I said, drawing on what I'd learned from decades of watching families navigate crisis, but only if both people are committed to rebuilding trust and working through the damage that's been done. And what about the baby? Brady asked, what happens if we stay together and the baby turns out to be Marcus's? Do I raise another man's child and pretend it's mine? Do I spend the rest of my life wondering if the child I'm loving belongs to someone else? Those are decisions you'll have to make together, I said. But they're decisions you can't make without knowing the truth first. Brady sat back down, his shoulders sagging with the weight of everything he was processing. When will we know? When can we find out for certain who the father is? There are tests that can be done during pregnancy, Ava said quietly, but they carry some risk to the baby. Most doctors recommend waiting until after birth for paternity testing, so I have to spend the next 4 months not knowing whether the baby we're preparing for is actually mine. Yes, she whispered. Brady was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands and working through the implications of everything he'd learned. When he finally looked up, his expression was calmer but more distant than I'd ever seen it. I need time, he said. I need to think about all of this, figure out what I want to do. Of course, Ava said quickly. Take all the time you need. I'm going to stay at a hotel tonight. Maybe for a few days. I can't be here right now, in this house, pretending everything is normal when nothing is normal anymore. Ava's face crumpled. Brady, please don't leave. We can work through this if we just talk about it. We are talking about it, he said, standing up and heading toward the stairs. But I need space to process what you've told me before I can have any more conversations about our future. He paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked back at both of us. Mom, thank you for being here tonight. I know this couldn't have been easy for you. I love you both, I said. I want whatever is best for your family, whatever that ends up looking like. After Brady left to pack a bag, Ava and I sat in the living room, listening to his footsteps in the bedroom above us and the sound of drawers opening and closing as he gathered his things. Do you think he'll forgive me? She asked. I think he loves you, I said. But forgiveness and love aren't the same thing. You've broken his trust in a fundamental way, and it's going to take time and work to rebuild that, if it can be rebuilt at all. What should I do while he's gone? Give him space. Don't pressure him to make decisions before he's ready. And figure out what you're going to do about Marcus. If Brady decides to work on the marriage, Marcus can't be calling and pressuring you about the baby, she nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue. I never meant for any of this to happen. I know, I said. But intentions don't erase consequences. The question now is whether you're willing to do the hard work of earning back his trust and rebuilding your marriage. When Brady came downstairs with his overnight bag, he looked older than he had a few hours earlier, as if the weight of this revelation had aged him in ways that couldn't be undone. I'll call you in a few days, he said to Ava. We'll figure out what comes next. I love you, she said as he headed toward the door. He paused, but didn't turn around. I love you too. But right now, I don't know if that's enough. After he left, I helped Ava clean up the dinner dishes and put away the remnants of what had been planned as a normal Saturday evening. As we worked, I found myself thinking about the cottage by the lake, about the quiet space where I could process what had just happened and figure out how to support both of them through whatever came next. The irony wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, I'd been asked to leave this house because my presence was supposedly interfering with their marriage. Tonight, I'd been essential to a conversation that might have saved it. Either way, my role in their lives had fundamentally changed, and I wasn't sure any of us knew what came next. The week following Brady and Ava's confrontation felt like holding my breath underwater, waiting to see if we would all surface or drown in the aftermath of such devastating honesty. Brady stayed at a hotel in town for 3 days before calling to ask if he could visit me at the cottage. The request surprised me. In all the months since I'd moved out, he hadn't once asked to see my new home. He arrived on a Thursday evening, just as the sun was setting over the lake, looking exhausted and somehow smaller than the confident man who told me about the pregnancy just a few months earlier. I made coffee and we sat on my porch, watching the water reflect the last light of the day while he struggled to find words for everything he was feeling. "I keep thinking about Dad," he said finally. About how excited he would have been about having a grandchild, about the stories he would have told and the fishing trips he would have planned. And now I don't even know if there's going to be a grandchild for him to be proud of. There's still going to be a baby, Brady. That hasn't changed. But it might not be my baby. It might be the child of a man I've never met, a man who had an affair with my wife while I was working extra hours to provide for our family. The bitterness in his voice was heartbreaking. But I also heard something else underneath it, a deep love for Ava that he didn't seem to know what to do with. "Have you been able to think about what you want to do?" I asked. "I think about it constantly. It's all I think about. But every time I start to make a decision, I realize there are no good options." He leaned back in the chair, staring up at the darkening sky. "If I leave her, I lose the woman I love and possibly my child. If I stay, I have to live with the betrayal and the uncertainty about the baby's paternity. What does your heart tell you?" "My heart tells me that I still love her, despite everything. My heart tells me that the baby feels like mine, regardless of genetics. But my head tells me that trust is the foundation of marriage, and I don't know if I can ever trust her again." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts about love and forgiveness and the complicated ways that families are formed and broken and sometimes rebuilt. "Mom," Brady said eventually, "I need to ask you something. And I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. When you were helping around the house these past few weeks, when you were seeing Ava every day, did you suspect what was going on?" I'd been expecting this question, but it was still difficult to answer honestly without making Brady feel that he'd been surrounded by people keeping secrets from him. "I suspected something was wrong," I said carefully. "Her behavior seemed secretive, and after the midwife shared her concerns about the pregnancy timeline, I began to watch more carefully for signs that might confirm or dismiss those concerns." "So you were investigating my wife?" I was trying to understand a situation that didn't make sense to me. The way I was asked to leave your house, the sudden urgency about establishing independence, Ava's stress levels during the pregnancy, none of it felt consistent with what I knew about your relationship. Brady nodded slowly. "Do you think I'm a fool for still loving her?" "I think love isn't something you can turn off like a faucet, even when you want to. And I think the fact that you still love her despite what she's done says something important about both your capacity for forgiveness and the strength of your marriage. But is love enough to rebuild from this?" "That depends on whether Ava is willing to do the work required to earn back your trust, and whether you're willing to do the work required to forgive her. Neither of those things will be easy or quick." Brady was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier, as if he was beginning to find his way towards some kind of resolution. "I want to try," he said. "I want to see if we can rebuild our marriage. But I need to know that the affair is completely over. And I need Ava to understand that rebuilding trust is going to take time and patience and absolute honesty going forward." "Have you told her this?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. To make sure I wasn't making a decision based on wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment of what's possible, I reached over and squeezed his hand. I think you're making a decision based on love and commitment and a mature understanding of what marriage requires. That seems like solid ground for moving forward. 2 days later, Brady moved back home, and they began the difficult work of rebuilding their relationship. I continued helping with household tasks 3 mornings a week, but the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Instead of being the outsider providing assistance to a self-sufficient couple, I was now an integral part of a family support system, helping them navigate crisis. Ava had ended all contact with Marcus, changing her phone number, and arranging to work with different departments at her job to avoid interaction with him. She'd also begun seeing a counselor individually, working through the issues that had led to her affair. While she and Brady started couples counseling together, the pregnancy continued normally from a medical standpoint, though the emotional weight of not knowing the baby's paternity created a constant undercurrent of tension. Brady threw himself into preparing for fatherhood with the determination of someone trying to convince himself that love and commitment mattered more than biology. Ava moved through her daily routines with the careful attention of someone trying to prove that she deserved the second chance she'd been given. I found myself in the unexpected position of being a bridge between them, helping them communicate when direct conversation became too difficult, providing perspective when they got lost in their immediate emotions, and offering the kind of support that could only come from someone who loved them both and wanted their marriage to succeed. Spring arrived early that year, and I spent my mornings working in the cottage garden, planting vegetables and flowers that would bloom throughout the summer and fall. The physical work of preparing soil and planting seeds felt metaphorically appropriate. We were all engaged in the slow, patient work of nurturing new growth from ground that had been damaged and depleted. Jonas had become a regular companion during these gardening sessions, offering advice about native plants and sharing cuttings from his own well-established beds. Our friendship had deepened unnaturally over the months, built on shared morning coffees and evening walks around the lake, and the comfortable companionship of 2 people who understood solitude as a choice rather than a burden. One evening in late April, as we sat on my porch watching the sunset reflect off the water, Jonas asked about Brady and Ava's situation with the gentle directness that had become characteristic of our conversations. "How are they doing with everything?" he said. "It can't be easy, working through something like that while dealing with the stress of a first pregnancy." "They're doing the work," I said. "Some days are better than others, but they're both committed to rebuilding their marriage." "And how are you doing with it all?" "It's a lot to carry, being so involved in their crisis." I considered his question. How was I doing? 6 months ago, I'd felt rejected and peripheral to Brady's life. Now I was more central to his family than I'd ever been. But under circumstances that were emotionally exhausting and complex, I'm grateful to be included, I said finally. But you're right that it's a lot to carry. Sometimes I feel like I'm walking a tightrope, trying to support both of them without taking sides or making judgments that aren't mine to make. You know, Jonas said, thoughtfully, there's something to be said for building a life that's complete on its own, rather than constantly adjusting to other people's crises. It wasn't a criticism, but it was an observation that made me think about the choices I'd been making about how to spend my time and emotional energy. Are you suggesting I should step back from their situation? I'm suggesting that you've built something beautiful here, he said, gesturing toward the cottage and garden and the peaceful evening settling around us. Something that belongs to you and reflects your choices and interests. Maybe it's worth considering how much of that you want to give up to manage other people's problems. His words stayed with me over the following days as I continued my routine of helping Brady and Ava navigate their challenges. Was I falling back into the pattern of defining myself through service to others? Was I so afraid of being peripheral to Brady's life that I was willing to give up the independence I'd worked to create? The question became more pressing when Ava went into labor 3 weeks before her due date. Brady called me at 6 in the morning, his voice tight with anxiety. "Mum, it's time. We're heading to the hospital. Can you meet us there?" I dressed quickly and drove through the early morning darkness, my heart racing with anticipation and apprehension. This baby a Brady's child or not? would be born today, and with that birth would come answers to questions that had dominated their lives for months. The labor was long and difficult, with complications that required monitoring and interventions that kept everyone on edge. I spent most of the day in the waiting room with Brady, holding his hand during contractions when Ava needed him and offering quiet support during the long stretches when there was nothing to do but wait. Finally, at 8:47 in the evening, their daughter was born. Brady emerged from the delivery room with tears streaming down his face and an expression of wonder that erased months of doubt and fear. "She's perfect," he said, pulling me into a fierce hug. "Mom, she's absolutely perfect." I followed him back to meet my granddaughter, this tiny person who had been the center of so much anguish and uncertainty. She was red and wrinkled and beautiful, in the way that all newborns are beautiful. But as I looked at her face, I felt a chill of recognition. She looked nothing like Brady, nothing like Harold, nothing like any member of our family. But she looked strikingly like Marcus Jameson, whose photograph I'd seen on Ava's company website during my weeks of investigation. Brady was holding her with such joy and love that I couldn't bear to say anything in that moment. Ava was exhausted but radiant, tears of relief and happiness streaming down her face as she watched her husband bond with their daughter. But I knew, and I suspected that Ava knew, that the paternity question had just been answered in the most definitive way possible later that evening. After Brady had gone home to get some rest and Ava was settled in her hospital room, I sat beside her bed and waited for her to acknowledge what we both could see. "She doesn't look like him," Ava said, finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "No." I agreed. "She doesn't. What am I going to do?" "You're going to love her and raise her and let Brady love her too, for as long as he wants to. But when he realizes ... he may never realize." People see what they want to see, especially when they love someone as much as Brady loves both of you. Ava closed her eyes, tears leaking from the corners. "I don't deserve his love. None of us deserve the love we receive," I said. "We just have to try to be worthy of it." 3 days later, they brought the baby home, and I watched Brady transform into the father he dreamed of being. He was gentle and patient and completely devoted to this tiny person who might or might not share his DNA, but who was undoubtedly his daughter in every way that mattered. Ava was struggling with postpartum depression complicated by guilt and fear about the secret she was still carrying. She'd arranged for a paternity test to be done discreetly, but the results wouldn't be available for another week. I found myself spending more and more time at their house, helping with the baby and the household, while Ava recovered and Brady adjusted to fatherhood. The cottage by the lake began to feel like a place I visited rather than lived, and I realized that I was once again defining myself through service to Brady's family rather than building my own independent life. It was Jonas who finally forced me to confront what I was doing. "You haven't been home for dinner in a week," he said when I encountered him in the garden one evening as I rushed back to grab more clothes for my extended stay at Brady's house. "They need help with the baby," I said. "It's just temporary, until they get settled into a routine." "Zoe," he said gently, "they have a baby. You have a life. Those aren't the same thing." His words stopped me cold. "What do you mean?" "I mean that 6 months ago, you moved here to build something that belonged to you. You've created a beautiful space, started a garden, developed friendships and routines that make you happy. Why are you willing to give that up to become an unpaid nanny for your adult son?" "I'm not a nanny. I'm a grandmother helping with a new baby. Are you? Or are you someone who's so afraid of being unwanted that you'll sacrifice your own well-being to make yourself indispensable to other people?" The question hit me like a physical blow because it was so obviously true. I had been so grateful to be needed again, so relieved to be included in Brady's life, that I'd immediately fallen back into the pattern of making myself useful at the expense of my own interests and independence. "They need me," I said weakly. "They need help," Jonas corrected, "but they can hire help, or figure out how to manage on their own, or ask other family members to assist. What they don't need is for you to sacrifice the life you've built to solve their problems." That night, I sat in my cottage for the first time in over a week, looking around at the space I'd created and the life I'd been building. The garden was beginning to show signs of neglect, and the pile of books I'd been planning to read sat dusty on the table. I'd been so eager to return to being essential to Brady's family that I'd abandoned everything that made me happy and fulfilled as an individual. The next morning, I drove to Brady's house for what I'd decided would be my last day of intensive help. They were managing better than they realized, and what they needed was confidence in their own abilities rather than continued dependence on my assistance. "Brady," I said as I prepared to leave that evening, "I think it's time for you and Ava to start handling things on your own." He looked up from where he was feeding the baby, alarm flashing across his face. "Are we doing something wrong? Are you upset with us?" "You're not doing anything wrong. You're doing everything right. But you're ready to be parents without constant supervision, and I'm ready to get back to my own life. But what if we need help? What if something happens and we don't know what to do? Then you'll figure it out, the way every new parent has throughout history. And if you have questions or need advice, you can call me. But you don't need me here every day." Relief and disappointment welled on Brady's face. "I guess," I thought, "I hope that maybe you'd want to move back in. Now that we're a real family with the baby." The invitation was everything I'd wanted 6 months ago, but now it felt like a trap rather than a gift. "Brady," I said gently, "I love you and Ava and the baby more than I can express. But I've built a life that makes me happy, and I'm not willing to give that up to become a live-in babysitter. You'll always be my family, but you're not my whole life anymore." It was the healthiest thing I'd ever said to my son, and possibly the most difficult. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset over the lake and feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from choosing yourself without sacrificing the people you love. Brady and Ava would figure out how to be parents. Their marriage would survive, or it wouldn't, based on their own efforts and commitment rather than my management of their problems. And I would continue to build the life I discovered I wanted, one that included family and love and service to others. But that was primarily defined by my own choices and interests and dreams. 2 weeks later, the paternity test results confirmed what I'd suspected from the moment I saw the baby. Marcus was indeed the biological father. Ava shared the results with Brady in the presence of their marriage counselor, and they worked through another crisis of honesty and forgiveness and commitment. Brady chose to stay, to continue being the father he'd already become regardless of genetics. Ava chose to commit fully to their marriage and to the ongoing work of rebuilding trust. And I chose to love them both while maintaining the boundaries that protected my own well-being. 6 months later, I was working in my garden when Jonas approached, with a cup of coffee and a smile that had become as familiar and comforting as the sunrise over the lake. "How's the baby?" he asked, settling into the chair beside where I was weeding the tomato plants, growing fast. "Brady sends pictures almost daily. She's starting to sit up on her own. And how are Brady and Ava? Working hard on their marriage, making progress, learning to trust each other again. And how are you?" I looked around at the garden I'd created, the cottage I'd made into a home, the life I'd built through my own choices and efforts. "I'm exactly where I belong," I said. It was the truest thing I'd ever said. And it had taken me 67 years to learn how to say it. Up next we have to more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.